You're listening to KZUM News on 89.3 KZUM Lincoln and KZUM HD. Good afternoon and welcome to today's edition of KZUM News, an hour dedicated to learning more about what is going on in Lincoln and the surrounding areas. I am the news director and your host, Amantha Dickman. Congress convened on Thursday, July 17th for a voting session that saw the approval of H.R. 4, also known as the Rescissions Act of 2025. The package rescinded almost $9 billion in previously allocated funds for foreign aid and public broadcasting funds, of which $1.1 billion was advanced funding set to go to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Before we get to the heart of today's story, and because transparency is important to KZUM News, we want to be clear about the fact that KZUM has received funding from the CPB in the past and is one of the many stations across our nation that will lose funding from the CPB due to the Rescissions Act of 2025. KZUM is not the focus of today's story. Public media is. We do, however, want to communicate how KZUM will be directly impacted. General Manager Carrie Semrad has a few words of wisdom for folks. Considering the rescission bill passed, what are the next steps moving forward?
Sure. Thank you for the question. So, as you said, Congress officially passed the rescission bill that, amongst other cuts, zeroes out dedicated funding for public media. And according to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, or the CPB, KZUM is one of the 1,500 public media radio stations whose funding is included in these cuts. And it's not just NPR-affiliated, PBS-affiliated television stations, or even people who are getting other direct funding from CPB. KZUM has received consistently over the last couple decades 25 to 30% of its budget from the CPB. And just for an example, this last fiscal year, we received $113,000. That is a large amount of money for KZUM, as a lot of our listeners know. They hear us asking for donations over our 3 fund drives a year and other various times throughout the season. There are stations all around the country, though, who are remote and a lot smaller than KZUM and receive up to 90% of their yearly budget in direct support from the CPB. Now, our CPB grant has allowed us to grow and to do a lot of things that we wouldn't be able to do just based on the generous support from our community alone. For example, we are able to offer our community news internship paid to anybody in Lincoln, regardless of access to a secondary education. We can take the time with our interns to make sure that they're learning journalism and the ethics of journalism, because they may not have already gotten that from another institution. And creating all of these wonderful citizen journalists and of all ages. That's a huge part of what we do with our internship program. We've also had a lot of extra funds this last couple of years to bring on knowledgeable contract radio engineers to help upgrade equipment, which a lot of our listeners know has been dying over the last few years. And without some of this extra funding from the CPB, we would not have been able to get to those repairs quickly enough and hire really knowledgeable people who their expertise comes at a price, and it's well deserved. Right now, we're working on a lot of really cool new initiatives. We're working on emergency messaging in multiple language, and we're also developing a hyper-local community news program, news briefs, updates in Spanish, as you know, Amantha. And so this year, we have given also over $60,000 in media access to nonprofit partners, so they don't have to go to another radio station that would charge a lot more, and they can still get the words out about their services and all the events that they do. And just for a little perspective of what KZUM does in general for the radio station, everybody knows that the biggest part of our programming is created and produced by volunteers. And as of the end of June, we approximate that they have produced over 3,500 hours of programming, whether it's music or public affairs of local stories. It's a huge impact on our community.
So what do you want listeners to know about what things are going to look like moving forward?
Well, we're going to see what happens next year. I know for fiscal year 26, we're going to be good. We're going to be coming to our listeners and asking for some extra donations, maybe another one extra donation a year than they're accustomed to giving. That always has been, and I'm sure always will remain, the largest part of our budget is listener support and local business support. So it's just incredibly important that the people who listen and are in our listening area support community radio, because when it comes down to it, when our local people participate in community media, that's when we're at our best. That's when we're at our strongest. So it really does make a huge difference the more our community can support us. Right now, what you can do to help is ask your friends, neighbors, families, co-workers, any of those folks, if they know about KZUM. If they don't, tell them to tune in, tell them to listen, and share why you love us. We can use as many new listeners and new eardrums on us and eyeballs on our website and social media. So please help be a good ambassador. Who are your community representatives? Let them know how important it is to have KZUM and stations like KZUM alive and thriving in your communities, in Lincoln in particular. Let them know what we do for the community and how it impacts your daily life. And just remember, anything can happen anything can happen before the next budgeting session. So make your voice known now. You can make a huge difference for us. Again, make an extra donation. We need to make up some ground so you can have a big impact on what KZUM is looking towards, especially as we head into our next fiscal year after our September rollover. September in 2026 and going into fiscal year 27 is going to look really different than this next year. We have some time to make up this ground. We just need to start working on it now. And always remember, with your help from the community, support from the community, we're not going to go anywhere. That's, I think, the big lesson in this. KZUM will be here. We want to stay just as weird and wacky and joyful and, of course, informative and as engaging as always. We've been doing it for 47 years. I'm committed to making sure we're doing it for at least another 47 years. The key is we just need you, the listener, to be a big part in making that happen.
The Corporation for Public Broadcasting is an independent, nonprofit organization created by Congress in 1967. One of its primary functions is that it distributes federal funding to public television and radio stations all across our country. Rima Da'el, the CEO for the National Federation of Community Broadcasters, is joining us this afternoon to tell us more about how this rescission bill will affect NFCB members all across the United States. Now I just had a blank. My brain just completely...
It's the National Federation for Community Broadcasters. It's a little archaic. That's why we just go by our acronym NFCB.
Just, have one of those moments where I look at the page, no thoughts, just vibes.
That's okay. No. I call those brain farts.
Absolutely. I've been having them a lot more lately, so clearly I need more sleep. But you're joining us here this afternoon as CEO of the NFCB. You deal with plenty of stations all across the country. Can you tell folks a little more about what it is the NFCB does and who you serve in this country?
Sure. We are a membership organization of 200 community radio stations across the country. That includes Alaska and Hawaii, and we've had some stations on and off over the years from Puerto Rico as well. But what's important to note is the community radio stations that we support are primarily not affiliated with NPR. We do have about 56 stations that receive direct funding in grants from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. 11 of those are affiliated with NPR. But according to Radio World, and they reported this number at the end of March, there are over 4,000 nonprofit radio stations across the country, and only about 1,000 of those are affiliated with NPR. So, what makes this rescission bill hurt basically the community radio stations, especially the small and rural stations that we represent, is that it impacts the content and distribution that comes from the public radio satellite system that many of our community radio stations um, basically hook up to be the last mile connector for the emergency alert system, the national weather systems, and that includes NOAA, so tornado warnings, hurricane warnings, earthquake warnings, like from all over the country. And then also in places that there is no internet or no cell phone, or radio, AM and FM radio, is literally the plan B for the entire country when electricity, internet, cable, and cell phones go down. We've seen this recently with the unfortunate incidents in Texas. We've seen this with the wildfires in California, when there's even tsunami and earthquake warnings in Alaska, flooding in Vermont, and with the horrific events that happened with wildfires in Maui. In Maui specifically, one of our member stations is 100% volunteer run. And when their own houses were burning, they were still showing up at the station to keep the radio station on the air, as it was one of a couple radio stations that were left. And the only way residents in Maui were getting any information, because there was no electricity, internet, and cell phone were down. The other important thing to note with our membership is when I say small, I really mean small. So NPR stations are usually staffed with professional staff, meaning all paid staff. Community radio stations rely on hundreds of volunteers. Many of them are 100% volunteer, but some of the larger of the small stations might have 3 to 5 paid staff, but still the average number of volunteers for our membership, each of the stations has at least 125 volunteers that host, that engineer, run the boards, do janitorial duties, as well as front desk receptionist duties.
So when we're sitting here and we're talking about this rescission package, you have two groups there that you are highlighting as being the most potentially impacted, right? You're talking about folks who are experiencing extreme weather events and folks who are in more isolated areas where they might not have other technology to kind of bridge the gap for communication.
Right.
So as you mentioned, most of the stations who are members of the NFCB are not NPR affiliates. So what does this look like for those stations moving forward to have a huge part of their funding potentially cut?
So, two things. One, most of the membership, one of the reasons why small stations join NFCB is the membership perk that we offer them, which is streaming music rights. And that's through an organization called Sound Exchange. And that is 100% funded by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So, with the defunding of public media, while the rhetoric has been about targeting NPR and PBS, it really is about defunding the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. That money that Congress allocates and has been recently clawed back through the rescission vote means that there's no money to pay for music rights, period, for community radio stations that have this perk through the NFCB membership to stream music. So that's going to be passed on to radio stations. And when you have a station that's 100% volunteer, all of the expenses that you have are things like microphones, headphones, the generator, the electricity bill, because you're not paying staff. And then to add the cost of streaming music rights on top of that might be the tipping point for a station to go dark. We are expecting that because of the impact of losing the Corporation for Public Broadcasting funding for both public safety and just for music rights, we could see 50 stations go dark within a year. Community radio, these are passionate friends and neighbors of you and me across the country, and they will stay on the air for as long as possible. But if they can't afford rent and they can't afford their electricity bill, that's going to be a huge burden to fundraise for, on top of the fact that they already rely on philanthropy and donations from their local communities. Broadly, what this also means is that there's going to be gaps of service for public safety. So that's the unintended, or maybe it is intended, but that's really the collateral damage in all of this, of the defunding of public media, because it's not going to hurt NPR and PBS at all. Those organizations are larger organizations. Sure, they may shrink in size, they'll cut their budgets, but they won't disappear. The folks that will disappear are the small community radio stations that provide companionship, that provide music, information, and news. And most importantly, they are part of the civic infrastructure for public safety around the country. So 50 stations might not sound like a lot with the amount of radio and news and information that exists, but there are still communities in our country, and there are still citizens in our country and residents that do not have access to fact-based information because there might be no cell phone service or no internet. The service we also provide is free. In order to get other services of news, information, and news, there's usually a paywall, whether it's cable or, whether it's a subscription to Sirius or even YouTube or Spotify, or even owning a cell phone requires a data plan. And so there are folks that don't have access to that kind of technology for free, and that's what community radio provides.
And obviously, as a newsroom, news deserts and information deserts are a topic that has always been a main conversation point for us, something we talk about more frequently than not. And so having those 50 potential closures, that's a lot of territory. And I don't think everyone in the United States can always visualize just how much of a geographic landscape that really covers. Just for an example, can you kind of lay out like how for those 50 stations, how much territory that really is? Do you have an idea of that?
Yes. When the Government Accounting Office and CPB looked at this, even as far back as 2007, quantifying the impact, the greatest impact is going to be in rural and tribal regions in the South, Midwest, and Southwest. However, that said, even in my home state of Connecticut, and formerly Massachusetts, you think, well, it's New England, right? We're tiny states. How can that impact? Well, there are regions still, even in Connecticut and Massachusetts, that don't have high speed internet or a cell phone tower. So even in what you would consider democratic states that are richer states than places like Kentucky or West Virginia or New Mexico, there are places in Connecticut and Massachusetts that are dead zones for internet and for cell phone. Now, there are, in Connecticut specifically, Litchfield County is one of those counties, but that's also where a lot of McMansions are. So there are other places and ways that if you can afford it, that you can tap in to other kinds of satellite radio, for example. But again, that doesn't mean everyone who lives in those communities can afford to pay for news and information. And that's one of the things that the original data for the news deserts really wanted to highlight, that newspapers, while you pay for a newspaper, the disappearance of certain newspapers meant the disappearance of the availability of low cost information. One of the things that even within the news desert data, community radio and public radio has always existed, and this includes community television as well, as a free resource. And that free resource, while it is free to the community, it isn't free to mount, as you know. I'm preaching to the choir. There are costs associated with your mic, your earphone, your field kit, and your time, right? Even if you donated your time, there are hard costs in producing content that is given free to the community. And that's really where the community donations that support public media and community radio come in. And that's the critical role of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So again, we're talking about losing stations in Alaska and Hawaii, but the majority of the loss will be in, the Midwest and Southern and Southwest rural regions that are actually predominantly red states or red regions. And so it was really disheartening to see the Republicans vote against their own citizens and residents that vote them into office. And so that means, Texas, Kentucky, West Virginia. There's one station in West Virginia that is a member. 68% of their funding comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And that isn't because that station is lazy or unable to raise the money from local residents and businesses. But when you're in rural regions, there literally might not be enough people to support your station. And that's the biggest difference between rural versus suburban and urban areas, where you can draw upon a larger community to support you. But that doesn't mean we as a country leave people behind and not have access to news and information that they need for the health of their families and their communities. I hope that all makes sense.
It absolutely does. And we've talked about a variety of potential impacts that are coming from this rescission bill that will be affecting local and regional stations there. Obviously, this wasn't what you had hoped to have happen, right? This wasn't the outcome you were hoping for.
Yeah, and the difficulty is to figure out now what, right? And so the National Federation for Community Broadcasters, we are a mighty staff of 3. We're smaller than some of our member stations that we support. And we've been talking to national partners since January about, are there ways that other national philanthropic organizations can help, for example, pay for music rights? Or what now with the public radio satellite system, and will tribal and small stations, especially rural stations, be able to access that satellite system, and who's going to pay for that access? I mean, the most horrific outcome of this is the defunding of public media um, takes away the impact of one of the best public-private partnerships that exist. Because, here is a nonprofit organization that primarily runs the public radio satellite system for the entire use of the public media, but then government agencies tap into that to strengthen our civic infrastructure. We don't know what's going to happen next. And so all I can say is, for now, until the next start of the government federal system, which starts on October 1st of this year, we're all good until then. But what happens starting October 1st and moving forward, that remains to be seen. But NFCB is, like I said, we've been talking to these folks nationally since January. Conversations continue. And there is some hope that CPB, in some way or form, in a skeleton version of itself, can continue to help us navigate what happens next.
Now, obviously, like you said, you don't know what to expect after October 1st, but you've been having these conversations. Have you heard from any representatives, senators at the federal level who are talking about potential stopgaps to help mitigate the effects from the loss of funding?
What we heard, so Senator Collins and Senator Murkowski were the only two Republicans that voted to stop the impact of rescission for public media, really focusing on the public safety outcome of all of this. However, what's happening now is that there are music rights and the impact of the music rights to artists and musicians that folks are now really figuring out that that's a big deal, right? And so this is where different groups are talking to their representatives. There is a carve out for some folks in Alaska and then some of the native stations. And there is hope that there might be funding from the Department of Interior to cover some of that. But the difficulty that I'm hearing from my colleague Loris Taylor, and she's the CEO of Native Public Media, is that while that gentleman's promise has been made, nothing has been codified to make that work, and there isn't a mechanism currently for funds to go from the Department of Interior to tribal stations or Alaskan stations to really make this work. So unfortunately, promises are great, but if there isn't a mechanism in place to transfer these funds, it becomes an empty promise. And that's the concern at this point. And that's why, unfortunately, we are looking at either, the upcoming vote for the fiscal year 26 budget, which is the appropriations budget, that is there a way that there, through that process, can be a carve out for public safety. The hard thing with all of this is the misinformation and disinformation about the impact of defunding public media has been framed from a culture war perspective, demonizing NPR and PBS, saying that they are a leftist propaganda institution. That's not true. Now, just because you disagree with news or information that's being shared, it doesn't make it factually incorrect. And the impact on NPR and PBS is minimal. However, the defunding of public media will absolutely destroy the community stations across the country and will have holes for the civic infrastructure around public safety.
Now, obviously, you've mentioned the misinformation surrounding this entire subject. We've talked a little bit about impacts on stations all across our country. And I guess the next question comes down to education aspect. How can folks learn more about this subject, about how to get involved, and what can they do to help, get involved, get vocal about this subject matter if that's something they want to do?
The easiest thing to do is to call your Congress representative. Going to 5calls.org is an easy way to do that, where the website will prompt you based on your zip code how and who to call, and literally give you a script to do that. Visit nfcb.org, and right on our homepage, you'll see connections to pieces that we've written about how this impacts community radio stations, non-NPR stations across the country. Because here's the thing, even if you hate NPR, you can't be anti-public safety. And that's what we're telling folks, that even if you disagree with the national programming that NPR or PBS promotes, the defunding of public media hurts your local community radio station that provides you everything from news you'll never hear on national outlets or regional outlets. It'll tell you information about where to go for your 4th of July parade to line up, right? Or when the Halloween parade is going to be coming up. But most importantly, God forbid a local community faces an active shooter or a horrific climate emergency. It is your community radio station that'll tell you where to go, what to do, and what to do next.
Excellent. And of course, that is all the questions I have for you this afternoon, Rima. But do you have any last minute thoughts you want folks to know as we talk about the defunding of the CPB with that rescission bill?
A $5 or $10 contribution goes a long way to support your local public radio station. So please do that now.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to tell us more about what's happening.
Thank you for having me.
A broad understanding of how the rescission of the funds allocated to the CPB will affect stations all across our country brings us to one question. What will the future of public media in Nebraska look like? After the break, we'll be sitting down with Stacy Decker from Nebraska Public Media to hear more about plans moving forward. If you stick around, we will be right back to learn more. And welcome back to today's episode of KZUM News. My name is Mantha Dickman, and I will be hosting the continuation of our story today. Congress convened on Thursday, July 17th, for a voting session that saw the approval of H.R. 4, also known as the Rescissions Act of 2025. The package rescinded almost $9 billion in previously allocated funds for foreign aid and public broadcasting funds, of which $1.1 billion was advanced funding set to go to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Before the break, we met with Rima Dal, the CEO of the National Federation of Community Broadcasters, to discuss the ripple effect of the rescinded funds on stations all across our country. Now, we have Stacey Decker, the General Manager and CEO of Nebraska Public Media, joining us to talk about what this means for public media in Nebraska specifically. Now, we have a few stations here in Nebraska that receive funding from Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and Nebraska Public Media is one of the biggest recipients here in our state. So we have Stacey here from Nebraska Public Media to tell us a little more about what we can expect for public media moving forward. Thank you for joining us, Stacey.
Thank you, Amanda. I appreciate the opportunity.
So obviously, this is, this isn't something that anyone, I think, really saw coming. I know that there were several efforts on behalf of our local representatives, both in Congress and Senate, to help save various aspects of CPB funding. Did you kind of see this coming? Were you in conversation with those senators and congressmen to kind of talk about what those impacts are going to be before the vote?
Yeah, I guess I didn't look into the crystal ball and see it coming as it probably rolled out. However, I think that we've all understood that federal funding could be at risk anytime. And so there's been a lot of conversation over the years in the public media system about our dependence on federal funds and how we use those funds. And we've been, I think, because we know that that's being scrutinized all the time, I think that public media has done an incredible job in utilizing the $535 million annually that comes to public media, at $1.60 per person in the country per year. I think it's a really good investment. To answer your question, yes, we were early in the process in touch with all the delegation and had a conversation. I went to visit them all in D.C. At what we annually go out to DC and have conversation to talk a little bit about what public media does for each state. And that's pretty much public television wide. Now we're both public TV and public radio here at Nebraska Public Media, but did have a conversation with each and every one of them about what it is we do. I'm a returning general manager to Nebraska Public Media. I was here 12 years ago as the chief technology officer and returned here about 9 months ago. So I had just kind of come back. And so this whole situation has evolved about the time I showed up here back in Nebraska. So we did have good conversation with all of the delegation and helped them at least. We started the discussion, at least I would say, on what the impact could be to public media if we lost those funds. And it varies across the country from station to station. Nebraska Public Media, as you pointed out, is one of the larger recipients of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting funding here in Nebraska, but that's because we're a consolidated state. For the most part, we have both radio and television across the entire state. There are a couple smaller organizations that do receive CPB funding here in Nebraska, but for the most part, we are what's known as a consolidated state. There are states like Minnesota, Florida, Texas, and a few others that have multiple public media stations, some in very rural communities and some with low populations. And those are the ones really they're going to have challenges. We've had such great support from the public media supporters in Nebraska. I'm very proud of that relationship that's been created over the 70 years we've been here. But yes, it's going to affect public media stations differently across the country.
And I'm glad that you mentioned that your stations are fairly consolidated. However, you've mentioned, and I'm sure most of our listeners are probably familiar since they're radio folks, that you do have stations all across the state. But to give listeners a little bit of a better picture of what that means, how many stations are all across the state affiliated with Nebraska Public Media?
Well, we have 9 television stations, and we just added 4 additional radio stations, so we're up to 13 radio stations. Then we've got translators across the state as well. So we're about 99% of the state is covered in some regard by television or radio, or a combination of the two.
And we met with Rima of the NFCB earlier this week to talk a little bit about what this means for their community members. But you just mentioned that you expanded to include 4 more radio stations. So I guess I'm wondering, she's talking about seeing potential programming cut, seeing potential station shutdowns. Is that something that folks can expect to see for Nebraska public media as well?
We've got a very wonderful relationship with the state of Nebraska. We're a diverse organization with our funding structure. Up until recently, we received state, university, and federal money on top of what I mentioned earlier in our community support. So we've got a really nice financial structure. 70-year-old organization, 70 years of being very conservative in our spending. And I think working directly with the state to invest in infrastructure across the state in rural communities where we know that our service is more important than ever. I do not anticipate us shutting down any broadcast facilities. However, I do believe that we're going to find ourselves listening a lot with NPR and PBS to determine exactly what the impact of this federal loss will be to content. We public media is unique in that we are not a network. We pay dues into PBS and NPR for national content. We receive that content from those organizations, and we pay in a certain amount, and they negotiate on behalf of all the public media systems, all these independent stations across the country, and then that content then is distributed to us, and we use that as a local and national relationship. That's the mix at public media, and at Nebraska Public Media. We do a lot of local and we do a lot of national, and that really gives a nice blend, and we really appreciate that. Now, of course, if there's less national content, we're going to have to replace that with local, and it's a bit early to tell exactly what and how this is going to impact content, but there's no question that it will. And so I think she's correct. I think we should anticipate the loss of some national content, both on television and radio.
And of course, with this rescission bill having passed, it's a little hard to predict what the future looks like. We're not sure whether there's going to be some kind of stopgap measure that our representatives are going to be coming up with. I know you mentioned earlier you were kind of in conversation with them prior to the rescission bill going to Congress. Now that it has passed, are you engaging in conversations about what that stopgap measure might look like potentially, if that's something they are willing to consider?
Yeah, we did engage early, as I mentioned. We engaged all the way up until the bill was passed. I had conversations and had sent emails to all the delegation. I heard back personally from a couple, had extensive conversation with a few about the impact, of course. And you're spot on. The work now starts to try to convey our message and our worth to those entities, to those individuals, to support us being written back into the 2026 budget so that we can get into an annual appropriation. I think it's really important to point out what was eliminated was funding that was appropriated to public media in a process which was called forward funded. We were a forward-funded organization. Public media was, CPB was specifically, but the stations were the recipients of that forward funding, and that was already appropriated by Congress. This has been in place since about 1975. This process was put in place so that public media could act as journalists and cover government and not be penalized financially in the moment. And so they forward funded public media to have some protections for us to be a voice for the public to be able to report on government and other things, not just government, but a lot of things. And so there would be no retribution. It's really important to understand why that forward funding process was put in place. It evolved to be a forward funding process to also allow us to plan for long-term productions. Some of these, especially television content, can take a couple of years to get the rights and everything in place. So between a protection mechanism so that we couldn't be penalized financially for being honest and transparent about our reporting, but also having the ability to plan for the future content that we're working on and that's in the pipeline.
And obviously, with this change, there's going to be a little bit of a gap there for the rest of this year up until the next appropriations budget meeting, which I believe is in October of this year. So there's a little bit of a gap for folks. However, starting October 1st, 2025, we're looking at the next year, obviously. So you're in conversation with our representatives. We're hoping to maybe get some kind of stopgap measure there. If you don't get a stopgap measure, what's the next plan?
Well, a lot takes place on October 1st if that's the case. It's hard to predict the future, but even in a situation where the budget is put together, I assume, this is just an assumption, that we likely are going to see a challenging budgeting process because of the structure of Congress at the moment. And if we see ourselves in what we call a continuing resolution, we've got to be written into that budget in order to be recognized in the continuing resolution. So there's work to be done, and obviously, as I mentioned, I'm going to commit to that, not only for the state of Nebraska, but for the community of public media. I assume I'll be spending a little time in D.C. to convey that message to our representatives. I think the immediate impact as of October 1. I've been in touch with CPB. I actually had worked at CPB prior to coming here in Nebraska Public Media, so I have a lot of contacts there. They do really good work. They're very passionate people. But as I understand it, if there's no more funding as of October 1st, they will implement layoffs and look for a process to shut CPB down. And that's going to be challenging. There's a lot of things that CPB pays for and does on behalf of all of public media. I mentioned we're not a network. That said, we still do things that resemble network, and that is in the distribution of content. We work with PBS and NPR to distribute content as efficiently and affordably as possible. That's all managed through CPB. And then a big one, which people wouldn't even imagine, is music rights. CPB negotiates music rights on behalf of the whole public media system. So when you hear us go into a break and there's a jingle or some aspect of that, or a program where there's background music, we negotiate rights on behalf of the whole system in order to use that music in our productions. If that goes away, that's a massive change and a quick one. So that's another thing that I've conveyed to our delegation, that CPB did more than just distribute cash. They actually were in the process and in the workflow of negotiating some of these contracts so that we have certain delivery capabilities and some components like music to continue to create local productions.
And those are the things that really elevate our productions. I say that as somebody who had music made specifically for their news program by one of our programmers. If we didn't have that programmer and we would have had to go out and find that music, that can be a costly experience that you have to go through, and not having the CPB there would be very sad and time consuming in terms of
It would take a lot of time. It's very expensive. It's also not efficient if we negotiate each of these individually. You should be out doing journalism. You shouldn't be negotiating, music rights. That's not I'm not picking on you, of course, but it's none of our core competency. So they had attorneys working through those contracts to negotiate it. It takes time to track it down. It's expensive. It's the right way to do it, the way it's set up currently, and it would be unfortunate to disrupt that. I think that's an unintended consequence of what's taking place today, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Now, pivoting just a little bit, something I also wanted to talk to you a little bit about is, there's a lot of misinformation that has been surrounding this rescission bill and the campaign to defund the CPB. And one of those is this conversation about NPR and its left-leaning bias potentially. So, can you talk a little bit about that misinformation that you've been hearing surrounding this and kind of talk about whether you think the public really needs to be concerned about that kind of stuff in terms of defunding CPB?
It's a different media world. I've been in public media for 29 years. Over the course of the years, I've worked in small markets and big markets in Boston and back here in Nebraska and medium-sized markets at CPB, as I mentioned. It's a different world. And, social media plays a role in disinformation, misinformation, unfortunately. You know, we do get calls, and we get calls that praise what we do, and we get calls that, give us their opinions about how we might do things differently. And, I really think that if we are 50% of what you like, we're doing the right thing because then our other 50% is in a place to do what the other side might like. And I don't want to make it about sides because that's definitely not it. We want to be honest in our reporting, and I couldn't be more proud of the staff here at Nebraska Public Media and the work that I've seen over the course of the 9 months that I've been back. And prior to that, the reason I'm back here is because I am so proud of this organization. This organization punches above its weight, does every day. We have people covering capital coverage down at the legislature. We've got such a diverse platform of content from sports to government coverage that we do, as I mentioned, Nebraska stories. There's no political bias in any of the things, in my opinion, that Nebraska Public Media does. And I couldn't be more proud of our staff. And I look forward to this organization doing it for 70 more years. We're vital when it comes to a rural community. We're definitely here and working with the University of Nebraska. We cover some, not all, but some of the Big Ten sports that comes through Nebraska. I'm sorry, comes through the university here at Nebraska Public Media. We've been doing the Supernovas games in Omaha. We're not Lincoln Public Media, we're Nebraska Public Media. I was just out in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, and meeting with some people, and heard very loudly from them how important we are in their community, to bring perspective and bring national coverage to problems and issues, and covering not only the problems but the opportunities and the successes of this great country. I heard widely from people in the rural communities how important we are, and I'm proud of that.
And so, knowing that you have that important role in our state, knowing that the next couple months to next couple years are going to require some creative thinking with moving forward, what do you want people to know about what is happening and how you're going to be moving forward? What's those last minute thoughts that you have?
I appreciate that opportunity because this is, this is a bit jarring, of course, disappointing, no question, but there's always opportunity in every change, in my opinion. And so I recently, yesterday morning, met with the staff here at Nebraska Public Media, and I've done that frequently over the course of the last 3 months to keep them up to speed on what's going on. I'm trying to be incredibly transparent, treat them as professionals because they are, and talk exactly about the impact to these decisions to our organization and to the system, and how we might brace for some of them and prepare for others, and how we might change to adapt to the current situation. And so what we're going to do now here at Nebraska Public Media, and have started already, we started prior to the vote even, start to scenario plan around the rescission package, put a plan in place to push hard to be reconsidered for the budget and the 26 budget, to ensure that some money is put back in the budget for public media, of course, and really start to talk about what it is we become. As I mentioned earlier, and we all acknowledge, and you're in this business as well, so I'm sure you've seen it. The media business has changed significantly. Has public media changed as quick as it should have? We've done a lot. We have changed. We've really pushed to be part of the digital environment. And that word digital can mean a lot of things. So we're actually, as a team, even defining what digital means so that we can put a really smart plan together that takes into account the situation we're in, but is forward-looking and determining exactly, to the best of our ability, the direction we need to go to continue to be a resource and a service to the state of Nebraska, because that's what we are, and that's important for us to maintain and continue.
And for folks who are looking to learn more, do you have any resources currently that you've got up on, say, your website or something where they can go read more about what this plan looks like from your end?
Absolutely. There's a number of sites, a number of spaces on our website, www.nebraskapublicmedia.org. They can go on our site. There's resources there to take a look at. And then obviously there's a lot of great content on that website as well that's free to them. That's a really good opportunity to also suggest that public media is different because we're free. Really quickly, if I could, I've heard a number of people say, public media can pivot and just compete in the commercial world. It's a lot harder than that, folks. We have non-commercial broadcast licenses. We don't have the ability to compete in the commercial world. It's illegal for us to compete in the commercial world. We can't act the same as commercial, and we shouldn't. One of those anecdotes is there's a website out there with free content, and that's accessible to anybody in this state and anybody in the country, www.nebraskapublicmedia.org, and we'd love to have you come and visit.
Thank you so much for sitting down with us. We appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to talk more about what this looks like for Nebraska Public Media.
Thank you, Amanda. I really appreciate it.
We are fast approaching the end of the hour, so here are your reminders for today. The KZUM Newsroom is always open to hearing about any questions, concerns, suggestions, or even any story ideas that you might want to share with us. All you have to do is give us a call at 402-474-5086, extension line 6. If you give us a call and we aren't available, don't forget to leave a voicemail. Or, if you aren't much of a phone person, you can also find our social media handles and more newsroom information at kzum.org under that About tab. Speaking of our website, if you happen to miss a show, you can always head to the KZUM News tab, where we archive all of our shows and include a transcript with links to that day's content. And lastly, I just want to give a shout out to Jack Rodenberg of the Rodenberg Music Experience. He put together all of the amazing original music that our news program uses. So once again, thank you, Jack. That wraps up our reminders for now. As you head out into the world, I hope you have a lovely day. Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll join us next time. You just finished listening to KZUM News, an original production of KZUM Radio that airs every Saturday at 11 a.m. Coming up next is Beta Radio, so stay tuned.